In the spring of 1621, half the settlers at Plymouth were already dead. The survivors were sick, starving, and certain the wilderness would finish the rest of them. And then a man walked out of the trees and spoke to them, in English. He was not a lost sailor, he was a native of that coast. And the reason he could greet them in their own language is the darkest secret behind the story America tells every November. Years before the Pilgrims ever crossed the ocean, he had already crossed it himself. In the other direction, in chains. The picture we are taught is simple and warm. Pilgrims in black hats, friendly Indians, a table piled with food, the first Thanksgiving. All of that is, in its way, true, but it is the last calm scene of a far darker story. A story about a plague that emptied a coastline, a man sold into slavery across an ocean, an alliance forged out of pure desperation on both sides, and a peace that the children of the people at that table would end in the bloodiest war New England has ever seen. To understand how they got there, start in a small English village called Scrooby. At the close of the 1500s, a group of Puritans there decided that the Church of England was still too close to Rome, and that every congregation should worship on its own, answering to no bishop and no king. This made them separatists, and in the eyes of King James, something close to traitors. Persecuted at home, they fled to Holland, led by their pastor John Robinson and their elder William Brewster. There they were free, but they were also poor, and they watched with horror as their children slowly became Dutch. If their faith was going to survive, they needed a country of their own, so they turned to America. They secured a grant of land from the Virginia Company and money from London investors, and in 1620 they set out. One of their two ships, the Speedwell, leaked so badly it had to turn back. Everyone who still had the courage crowded onto the second ship, a wine hauler called the Mayflower, 102 souls packed below decks. On the 6th of September, she left England behind. For 63 days, the Atlantic threw storms at her. A main beam cracked and had to be forced back into place with a great iron screw, and they were aiming for the mouth of the Hudson, hundreds of miles south of where they would actually land. On the 9th of November, they sighted not the Hudson but the cold sandhook of Cape Cod. For reasons no one fully recorded, the captain refused to sail farther south. That refusal changed everything, because it meant they were about to settle far outside the borders of any government that had authority over them. There was no law here, and some of the non-religious passengers began to mutter that on shore they would do as they pleased. So before anyone stepped off the ship, 41 men gathered in the Mayflower's cabin and signed a compact, a promise to make their own just laws and obey them for the good of all. The Mayflower Compact was one of the first times in history that ordinary people simply wrote down a government and agreed to live under it. They elected John Carver their governor and only then went ashore. The land they explored was frozen and hostile. Scouting parties dug up buried baskets of Indian corn hidden beneath the snow and took them. They were attacked by natives in the dark and barely escaped to the boat. Finally, in late December, they crossed the bay and landed at a place with a good harbor and cleared fields, which their maps already called Plymouth. It should have been a beginning. Instead, it was the start of the dying. It was the dead of a New England winter, and they had almost no shelter. Cold and disease tore through them week after week. At the worst of it, only a handful of people, as few as 7, were well enough to stand, and they spent their days nursing the sick and burying the dead. Governor Carver himself did not survive the season. By the time spring came, roughly half of the 102 were in the ground. William Bradford, who took over as governor, would later write it all down with a steady, grieving hand. If the spring had come even a little later, there might have been no colony left to save. But here's the question the old paintings never ask. Why was there cleared, open farmland waiting for them on that coast at all? Fields already broken, baskets of corn already buried. The answer is a horror the Pilgrims walked straight into without understanding it. Only 3 or 4 years earlier, a plague, carried by European fishermen and traders who had been visiting these shores for decades, had swept down the New England coast and killed the native people by the thousands. Whole villages had simply died. The tidy, empty ground the Pilgrims thought God had prepared for them was in fact a graveyard. They built their town on the bones of a town that was already there, And that is where the man who spoke English comes in. In March of 1621, a Wampanoag named Samoset walked boldly into the settlement and said, by every account, "Welcome, Englishmen," words he had picked up from fishermen along the coast of Maine. A few days later, he returned with someone whose English was far better. His name was Tisquantum. History remembers him as Squanto. Squanto was Patuxet, and Patuxet was the very place the Pilgrims were now standing on. Years before, in 1614, an English captain named Thomas Hunt had lured Squanto and some 24 other natives aboard his ship, chained them, carried them across the Atlantic, and sold them as slaves in Spain. Squanto somehow survived that. He made his way to England, learned the language, and after years talked his way onto a ship home. He reached his own coast around 1619 and found no one. The plague had killed every last member of his village while he was gone. He was the sole survivor of the Patuxet, standing in the ruins of his own people, on the ground where a boatload of strangers had just decided to build. Everything he loved was already buried under their new town. Squanto could have destroyed them. Instead, for reasons we will never fully know, he stayed. He brought the Pilgrims to Massasoit, the Sachem of the Wampanoag, and helped broker a treaty of mutual defense between them. But we should not mistake this for a simple fairy tale of kindness. Massasoit's own people had been gutted by the same plague, while their old rivals, the Narragansett, had been spared and were now dangerously strong. A starving band of well-armed Englishmen was, to Massasoit, exactly the ally he needed. The famous friendship of the first Thanksgiving was, at its heart, a cold calculation of survival made by two peoples who were each too weak to stand alone. For that first year, Squanto kept the Pilgrims alive. He showed them how to plant corn and fertilize it with fish, where to catch eel, how to move through a world that would have swallowed them without him. Bradford called him an instrument sent of God for their good. Squanto also played his own dangerous games, using his position as the go-between to frighten other villages and inflate his own power, a game that nearly got him killed by his own people, and he was dead within about a year and a half. But by then, he had done the one thing that mattered. He had gotten the colony through. In the autumn of 1621, the Pilgrims brought in their first real harvest, and they held a celebration. Massasoit came, with some 90 of his men, and 5 deer they had killed for the feast. For about 3 days, English and Wampanoag ate together on that coast. It was not called Thanksgiving. It was not a solemn church service. It was a harvest festival, loud and ordinary, between two groups who needed each other and for one season had found each other. That is the fragile moment we have frozen and framed and hung on the wall of the whole nation. And for a while, remarkably, it held. The peace between Plymouth and the Wampanoag lasted more than 50 years, longer than almost any promise between the newcomers and the native nations ever would. But it held only because it still served both sides. As the English kept coming, ship after ship, and the land kept slipping away, the arithmetic changed. A generation later, the man who inherited that broken bargain was Massasoit's own son, Metacom, whom the colonists called King Philip. He had watched the English multiply, watched his people's land and independence bleed away, and in 1675 he decided the treaty was a slow death and chose a fast one. King Philip's war set New England on fire. Measured against the size of the population, it remains one of the bloodiest wars in all of American history. Town after town burned. Thousands died on both sides. The world the first Thanksgiving had opened up came apart in blood. King Philip was hunted down and killed in the summer of 1676. The colonists cut off his head and set it on a pike at Plymouth, the same Plymouth of the Harvest Feast, where it stayed, staring out over the town for some 20 years. His wife and his young son were captured and sold into slavery in the Caribbean, and there is the terrible circle. The alliance that began the story of Thanksgiving ended in exactly the place where Squanto's story had begun, with a Wampanoag family in chains on a ship crossing the sea. So every November we set the table for the beginning of a friendship. And the friendship was real. Two desperate peoples, for one bright season, choosing each other instead of the knife. But the empty land was a graveyard emptied by plague. The man who made it possible had come home from slavery to find everyone he loved already dead. And the peace at that table was a truce that the next generation would bury and then be buried by. The picture is true. It is just the smallest, kindest corner of a much larger and much darker painting. The real question isn't whether the first Thanksgiving happened. It's what exactly they were giving thanks for, and who would end up paying for the feast.